So, welcome to the second part of Is the Bible Still Fully Relevant? And also, this is a standalone lesson of understanding the Bible. The first part is the Bible still relevant? Was discussing with all of the old uh, laws and the dimensions of the ark and the layout of the tabernacle and all of the historical information about all the kings and the ancient Israelites. How is that relevant to us today, and why do we need to worry ourselves about that, about reading that? And is that still useful to us today? And I think that after reading the second part of the Sunday school lesson, understanding the Bible, once you understand how the Bible's laid out, what its purpose was, and how to read the Bible, then I think that we'll understand if indeed the entire Bible is still relevant to us. And also it gives the conclusions at the end, with also be able to address if someone might have the question, is the Bible relevant? And to new Christians on how to read the Bible so they can get the most out of it. So the following few slides are adapted from John Pavlovitz's. He has an excellent article on the web that shows at the very bottom of the screen 5 things I wish Christians would admit about the Bible. And he goes in there and describes how the Bible is set up very well. So I recommend reading that. But here is the gist of the article with my adaptations to it. So the Bible is not really a book. It is a collection of books. It's a library. And in that library, there are 66 individual books. They run the diverse gamut of writings from poetry, history, biography, church teachings, and letters. So a very diverse group of writings. Those books have dozens of authors, from shepherds to prophets to doctors to fishermen to kings. So many, many different walks of life come together, and they approach things from a different perspective. These diverse writings each have a very different target audience, depending upon different life circumstances and specific agendas for their work. So they're not all written to a churchgoer or to a farmer. They're and everybody can get something out of these books, but they're not necessarily written to one particular audience, like a novel would be, or even an encyclopedia would be. So don't approach each book the same way. For the same reason, you wouldn't read a poem about leaves in the same way you would read a botany book. A botany book talks about the science of the leaves, and the poetry would talk about maybe the beauty of the leaves. So they're both talking about the same subject, but they're approaching it from different viewpoints. Some are for inspiration and some are for information. We receive them and see them differently. If we can see the scriptures in this way, as many diverse works telling one story in one collection, Christians can free themselves from the confusion about what they mean when they say literal. And that's one of the problems with reading the Bible, is understanding what is literal and what is figurative. And when you're reading about poetry, you're going to have much more much more figurative information in there than literal information. So it helps when you understand how the Bible is written and for what purpose. You'll be able to understand that a little better. We don't have to equate history with allegory, with poetry, or read them in the same way. We can also see the Bible as a record, not just of God, but of God's people, and we can find ourselves within it. Our second point is to understanding the Bible is the Bible is not as clear as we would like it to be all the time. Individual passages were not necessarily meant to be definitive answers to a subject, unless the author was addressing that very same question. We oftentimes want answers, and we look in the Bible. Most of the time, they're questions about curiosity, um, and so that's fine. That's fine to look in there. But we got to remember the purpose of the Bible was not necessarily just to satisfy people's curiosity, but it's a book on how to live your life. And there are certain questions that just aren't answered in the Bible. But the entire Bible must be taken into account. You can't just, and this is where we get into trouble a lot as in the different denominations of the church, and also in arguments of between Christians, where we take one specific area of the Bible and don't look at the entire Bible, and therefore we can get misled because our interpretation might be incorrect, or we put too much emphasis on one area and not the entire Bible. I don't want to get into too many instances here, but loving your neighbor as yourself basically says do everything in love. So when you go and correct somebody, and indeed in the Bible, when there sometimes needs to be correction, but you don't do it with hate, or you do everything in love. It's sometimes unclear whether a passage is meant to be taken literally or figuratively. And this is where we also have a lot of difficulties, because when the Bible is written, it was written by humans, and humans are writing about what they know, and they're going to be talking about their culture because it was written for people at that time of the writing. And so they're going to, the way women were in society, for example, just off the top of my head here, the women wearing hats in church. Does that mean women are supposed to wear hats in church today? That was the culture at that time, and it was to show respect. And so the meaning is do it with respect. So that's the figurative part of what they were talking about. Also in the Psalms, whether it was be taken literally or figuratively, the Psalms were poetry. So there's a lot of things in there that they're taken figuratively. But one thing is clear: the Bible does not contradict itself. If it seems to be, then we're not interpreting it correctly. If you make this base assumption, it will push you to continue to investigate to find the true answer. That's very important, that you need to make that base assumption that the Bible does not contradict itself. There's many passages that seem to contradict itself, but indeed it doesn't. So if it does, let's make sure that we keep researching until we can find a different interpretation of one particular passage so that it agrees across the entire Bible. Very, very important. Now, there are some answers to some, some of the times we don't get the answers that we want about, let's say when the end times are going to occur. There's some mentions of it in the Bible, but it is not clear, and by no means can we take which ones are going to be true or not. I should say, if we're interpreting things correctly or not. So there are some curiosities that are not answered, but God doesn't necessarily want us to know that. So there are many questions that are not clearly answered in the way we want them to be. Many of the questions are not specifically answered. Again, like the end times, were there other worlds before ours, and just on and on and on. There's lots of different questions that we have, and they're fair. It's fine to have these questions, and it's great to do the research in the Bible, because a lot of questions can be answered, or we can be fairly sure after going through the Bible, that if it says things in many different areas, it's most likely that we're going to get the right answer as long as everything agrees. However, some questions are answered in a catch-all way. And what I mean by that is, let's say take 1 Corinthians 16:14, do everything in love. So, what does that mean? Well, that means love your brother as yourself, do everything in love. So whenever you have to confront somebody about a disagreement, or hey, does this person deserve this? Should I, whatever the question is, if you do everything in love, that will answer a lot of questions. And then there's, but what if they do this? But what if the answer's still the same. Do everything in love. Sometimes it may not seem fair. Sometimes uh, you will uh, be kicked because you did something. But remember, we do things not uh, for humans on earth. We do things for God in heaven, and God knows what's in your heart at all times. So again, do everything in love because He understands what the purpose you're doing things for. A second uh, point of understanding the Bible is the Bible was inspired by God, not dictated by God. And so therefore we have humans writing the Bible, and they wrote it from their perspective. So the various authors um, wrote from their hardship of times. Let's say in the Psalms, David wrote when he was in anguish or when he was being chased by Saul. He wrote some of those Psalms, and it was from his perspective that he was writing from. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, when he was writing Jeremiah, it was his hardship. What he was seeing was going on. Likewise, in other areas of the Bible, for instance, Matthew intended to prove to the Jews Jesus' fulfillment of the Old prophet, or of the Old Testament. I'm sorry, fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. So he was more writing to the Jews, and his point was more towards, look, Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. Whereas Mark's account showed who Jesus was and what he did. Luke's overall perspective was Christianity's universal nature and appeal, and John's intent was to prove conclusively that Jesus is the Son of God and that all who believe in him will have eternal life. So now these are more of my words, and obviously each of these gospels do go into Jesus' life much more than this. But these are more of the perspective. Each of these gospels were written to a different group of people from a different perspective and purpose, yet all speak to the same subject. So this is sort of like if you went and saw a movie, and after the movie, the group of people that you went with, some people will talk about how fantastic the movie was, or the music was, how some people would say the special effects, and they talk about the acting and the storyline itself. But you're all talking about that same movie, but people have different perspectives. Some people might be a music person, and they're going to appreciate the music more. That's sort of like the Jews are going to understand and know the Old Testament more, and so they're going to be more uh, more interested in that. So again, all the gospel talks about the same thing. It's just from different viewpoints. Each of these books are inspired by God and written by humans for a particular audience and purpose. So I am not at all saying that none of this is not the truth. What I'm saying is that a human writes from their perspective and under their culture and their viewpoint. So it's still the same truthful subject. It's just from a different view. A third truth that we need to understand is we all pick and choose the Bible we believe, preach, and defend. I'm not talking about the different types of Bibles like the King James, the NIV, the Message. I'm talking about specific subjects in the Bible. Christians often accuse believers of differing opinions or of cherry picking from the Bible, holding tightly to verses they agree with while conveniently jettisons the ones they're uncomfortable with. So we often hear people talk about, and they grab a certain section of the Bible, and they say how terrible one person is, or they use it to judge other people, or they use it for their political views, where they can say, hey, look, this is what Jesus says. But what they're not doing is they're not doing everything Jesus says and making sure everything is putting into context. As Christians, we need to observe all of Jesus' teachings, not just the ones that we feel good or we do good on or we like. So, feeding the poor, visiting the people in prison, and showing love to everyone. These are the types of things that we need to do and not just the ones that we want to do. And that's hard. I mean, Jesus is a high standard for us to measure ourselves against. And we're not going to ever do as good as what Jesus told us to do. However, we can continue to try, and we need to be careful on how we use the Bible. It's not to be used as a weapon. It's to be used as a guide to how we should conduct our lives, and making sure that we don't use it to go after somebody just because we don't like their point of view. But we need to do things in love and do it as the Bible told us to do. Another point is God is so much bigger than the Bible. We like to think that God is contained within the Bible, but by no means. The Bible was never intended to fully describe who God is and everything He does. There's so much that the Bible doesn't talk about, and we can't assume by any means just because the Bible doesn't talk about something that it is non-existent. And I'm just going to throw something out here just off the top of my head. Other worlds, let's say, life on other planets. The Bible does not address that whatsoever. And because the Bible doesn't address it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, I'm not saying there is life on other planets, but I'm saying is just because the Bible doesn't talk about something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we need to be very, very careful here in how we read the Bible. The Bible tells us what we need to know. It's not a tell-all book. So what we need to know in the Bible is that Jesus came to earth to save us from our sins. He died on the cross, rose again, and if we believe in Him, we'll have everlasting life. And it also gives us a guide on how to live as Jesus wants us to live, and to show our love to others. So that's what it says in the Bible, and because it says that's what we need to do. Doesn't talk about all the stuff that Jesus knows. These people that talk about the end of times. When the end of the earth is going to be, because they can go in there and peer into the Bible and look at this reference and that reference, and therefore they can determine when the end times are. Jesus said Himself He doesn't know. So how in the world would these people know that? They don't. They don't know that. So we have to be careful on trying to mystically read into the Bible. We do need to research the Bible, and a lot of our answers can be found if we do enough research, but not trying to peer into the Bible when it doesn't say about things. John Pavlovitz had a really nice metaphor here. Billions of words have been written about the ocean. We could gather up every single one of them, the most beautiful, vivid, accurate descriptions of fishermen, marine biologists, and poets. We could read every last word about the ocean to someone who has never been there, and it would never do it justice. I think that's really good. There's simply no way to adequately describe the oceans in words. You have to experience it. It is so much more the case with God. I think that's very well written, because again, it's very, very true. You need to experience God, and reading the Bible will help you experience it. But until we actually meet God, we will truly never understand even a fraction of what we do on earth, what we will in heaven. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that wonderful to think in the future we will have so much more knowledge and understanding, and we think we love Him now. It's nothing compared to when we actually meet Him. So I want to just have a slide here on for those of you who may have never read the Bible. I highly suggest that you do. We need to stop always taking other people's word, especially now that the internet is so big and everybody has these weird ideas. I would say probably 80% of them have never read the Bible, or I should say at least the entire Bible, and have studied it. So you need to read it for yourself. And I think, when people have all these doubts, and even non-believers, when they have doubts about, who Jesus was, the Christianity itself, I think once they get back to the original book, and they're going to understand and appreciate what Jesus said and did so much more. So these are my suggestions on how to read the Bible for the first time. The Bible is not intended to be read at like a novel from beginning to end in sequence. That's one of the hardest things for someone to understand, because everybody's used to reading books from the front to the end. But it's not really, I don't suggest that you do that. New believers are encouraged to read first the account of Jesus in the Gospels and then the rest of the New Testament. So start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then go to the epistles, which are then Acts, and read the New Testament from beginning to end, and you can do that as a novel. Revelations you might want to skip until you read the Old Testament. Revelations is the last book in the New Testament, but I would suggest that that you read first the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as far as whether, those, if you want to pick up a Catholic Bible or a Protestant Bible, it doesn't matter. The New Testament in the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible are exactly the same. So I would suggest that you just read whatever one that you would feel most comfortable with. However, there are different versions. My personal preference is not to read the King James Version at first. I know that certain denominations like the King James, and that's fine, but as a new reader, King James can be a little bit harder to read because it's written in a older method of writing. And I would suggest maybe the Message, the Living Bible, the NIV, or any of those more modern Bibles. Read through there, and then if you want to go to the King James, great, that's fine. It's just a little easier to read than the King James. The Old Testament is the background that will help fill in the references made in the New Testaments, the so-called backstory. A lot of references are made in the New Testament to the Old Testament, and so it is great to understand where that came from. And so the Old Testament is sort of like the prequel to the New Testament, and you'll get a lot of value out of it if you read the New Testament first, then reading the Old Testament, and then maybe reading the New Testament again after reading the Old Testament. I think you'll get a lot more appreciation and understanding of the Old Testament once you read the New Testament. The Bible is the most researched and referenced book of all time. Using a study Bible will help in referencing other passages to show how interconnected the Bible is across 40 authors, 1,500 years of writings. It's truly amazing. I mean, once you read the Old and the New Testament and see how interconnected it is across so many authors and so many years, you'll understand there's no way that God didn't have his hand in reading and help creating this Bible. But again, a study Bible, and NIV has a lot of study Bibles. I personally like using the NIV study Bible. It has a lot of references, and so when you read a passage, you might say, not sure what that means. You can look at the references below, and you'll have a lot better understanding. Sometimes you may not want to use the references. You can understand it, you keep on going, but I highly recommend a study Bible. It's very, very useful. So to get back to part one of the study, which was, is the Bible still fully relevant today? What do you say to someone who says the Bible's not fully relevant today? Well, as Christians, we are followers of the New Testament, i.e. the New Covenant or the New Promise, and therefore use the Old Testament as a history and not our direct guidebook. And I think that's important because if you look at, some of the people will say, well, look at how violent Christianity is, and we obliterated people back then, and so on. Well, that's the Old Testament. That's back when we were Jews and we didn't have the new guidebook, which is the New Testament. And the New Testament shows how we are supposed to conduct our lives, and it is to show love. Not to say that we don't follow the laws of a lot of the laws of the Old Testament, because they're repeated in the New Testament, if nothing else other than to show love, first to God and then to others. So it's again, it's looking at the New Testament. It's still extreme. It's fully relevant today. So as new Christians should read what Jesus says in the Gospels. When they study his meaning, there'll be no doubt that what he says is still fully relevant. Again, we need to separate the culture. When Jesus was speaking, he wasn't speaking to people 2,000 years in the future. He was speaking to people at that day. So he used the stories and culture of that time, but the meaning is still exactly relevant today as it was back then. The New Testament Gospels are also fully relevant once the meaning and culture are separated from each other. This can sometimes be challenging to separate and thus must be researched. So you'll hear people say, wait a minute, they need to get with the times. They want women to wear head coverings and not speak, and they can't be ministers and so on. And they said that's not with the times here. Well, again, we need to separate what culture was like back then and what the meaning was. And that's not necessarily easy, because we don't want to just dismiss something saying, oh, that was just the old culture. That's not relevant anymore. We need to be careful. We can say that the culture may not have been relevant, but the meaning of what they were getting at is. And so the head covering, again, showing discretion. We can show discretion today without a head covering. We can, and we can, as far as women being ministers, that's a different subject, and I don't want to get into it because a lot of people have different opinions on that. But again, we need to understand the meaning. Women back then were not trained, and therefore they didn't have the background to be able to teach others. So again, let's look at the meaning and separate that from the culture. And I think that everyone will say that once we do that, the Bible will still be fully relevant today. So this is the conclusion of this study, and both of the first part, is the Bible still relevant, and the second part is understanding the Bible. Again, understanding the Bible is important to understand how the Bible is relevant. So the question is, as far as the Bible being relevant, can kind of be broken down into two different ways of the question. The first one is the relevant can have different meanings. So if we break it down into two different questions, is the entire Bible still important and worth studying? Well, the answer is a resounding absolutely. We need to understand the background of many of the references in the New Testament to get the meaning. Jesus quoted many of the Old Testament prophecies and scriptures to validate that he is truly the Son of God. Likewise, so did several of the authors in the New Testament. So it's important to understand the Old Testament in order to be able to fully understand the New Testament. Just as it's important to take history in school, it's important to read the Old Testament. As the saying goes, history repeats itself. And would people say that learning history is not important? Maybe some of the school children when they're learning the history, but I think they'll understand that it is important to have that background to understand what works and what doesn't work. And we have to work very hard to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that happened in the Old Testament. So then the second part of the question is, does everything in the Bible still pertain to us in our lives today? So pertaining to us in our lives today, I would say no. We live in the New Covenant, New Testament, or New Promise of Jesus Christ. Jesus changed the world forever when he died and rose again. The New Testament meanings are the same. The culture changes, but the lessons and the teachings remain the same. So although the Old Testament we don't follow the Old Testament in our day-to-day lives because we follow the New Testament, many of the rules are still the same. They're brought over. Remember how we have to look if they're in the New Testament and the Old Testament, then they're most likely the same. So we do need to understand the Old Testament to get the full meaning of the New Testament. But we live in the New Testament times as Christians. I hope everybody enjoyed this Bible teaching, and if anybody has any suggestions or comments, feel free to put them on the YouTube page, and I will try to respond to them. Thank you very much for listening.